The rain was relentless, drumming against the windows of Detective Elijah Cross's modest apartment. He sat hunched over his cluttered desk, the warm glow of a single desk lamp cutting through the gloom. Piles of old case files, coffee-stained notebooks, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey filled the space around him. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, but sleep was a distant thought. The phone rang, sharp and sudden, shattering the silence. Elijah hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. Midnight calls rarely brought good news. With a sigh he picked up. "Cross," he said, his voice rough from too many late nights and unanswered questions. "Detective Cross," a woman's voice said, low and urgent. "You don't know me, but I need your help. It's about Maya Townsend." Elijah froze. Maya Townsend. Her name was a ghost that had haunted him for years. A journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption, she had vanished 5 years ago without a trace. Her disappearance had become a cold case, one of many Elijah had never been able to let go of. "Who is this?" he demanded, gripping the phone tighter. "That's not important," the woman replied. "What matters is that Maya's case wasn't just mishandled. It was buried. And I can prove it." Elijah's pulse quickened. "Go on. Check your email," the woman said. "I've sent you files, evidence the department didn't want anyone to see. If you care about justice, you'll look at them." Before Elijah could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone for a moment, the dial tone buzzing in his ear, then set it down. His laptop sat nearby, still open from his earlier work. With a few clicks, he opened his email. Sure enough, there was a message waiting for him, sent from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "For Maya." Elijah's chest tightened as he opened the email. Attached were scanned documents, photographs, and transcripts of interviews from the original investigation. As he scrolled through, the discrepancies jumped out at him. Conflicting witness statements, missing evidence, and timelines that didn't add up. One photo in particular made his blood run cold. A grainy image of Maya standing in a dimly lit alley, looking over her shoulder as if someone was following her. The timestamp was the night she disappeared. "Damn it," Elijah muttered, leaning back in his chair. He'd always known there was more to Maya's case, but seeing it laid out like this made it undeniable. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. The rain continued to pour as Elijah grabbed his coat and badge. He knew he should wait until morning, but the fire in his gut wouldn't let him rest. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The precinct. The precinct was nearly deserted when Elijah arrived. The graveyard shift officers barely glanced at him as he made his way to the archives. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the rows of filing cabinets. Elijah pulled Maya's file and spread it out on a nearby table. He compared it to the documents from the email, his sharp eyes catching detail after detail that didn't match. Witnesses had recanted their statements. Evidence had been logged incorrectly. Leads that should have been followed were dismissed without explanation. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered to himself. As he worked, a memory surfaced, the day he'd first heard about Maya Townsend. She'd been a relentless reporter, fearless in her pursuit of the truth. She'd made powerful enemies, but she'd also inspired admiration from those who believed in justice. Elijah had been one of them. Her disappearance had shaken him, not just as a detective but as a human being. He closed the file, his mind racing. Someone had wanted Maya's story silenced. Someone with the power to manipulate the investigation. But who? And why? Elijah left the precinct as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside him had just begun. Maya's family. Elijah's next stop was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. The front porch light flickered as he approached, casting long shadows across the yard. He knocked on the door, and a moment later, it opened to reveal Amara Townsend, Maya's younger sister. Amara's eyes widened when she saw Elijah. "Detective Cross," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and hope. "Is this about Maya?" Elijah nodded. "I think I might be able to find out what happened to her. But I need your help." Amara stepped aside, letting him in. The living room was small but cozy, filled with photos of Maya and her family. Amara gestured for Elijah to sit on the couch. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Anything you can tell me about the days leading up to her disappearance," Elijah said. "Anything she might have said or done that seemed unusual." Amara's face clouded with sadness as she thought back. "She was working on a big story," she said. "She wouldn't tell me much, but I could tell it was important." She seemed scared though. Like she knew she was in danger. "Did she mention any names? Any threats?" Elijah pressed. Amara shook her head. "No, but she kept saying something about exposing the truth. She believed in what she was doing no matter the risk." Elijah glanced at a framed photo of Maya on the mantel. She was smiling, holding a notebook, her eyes filled with determination. It was the face of someone who believed the truth could change the world. As he left the Townsend house, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maya had been fighting for justice and now it was his turn. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was darker than he had imagined. The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Elijah Cross sat in the dimly lit archives of the precinct, surrounded by a sea of dust-covered files. The room smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the kind of place where forgotten stories went to die. He flipped through Maya Townsend's original case file, the yellowed pages crinkling beneath his fingers. The rain outside drummed against the windows, a somber soundtrack to his investigation. The file was thin, too thin for a case that had gripped the city for months. He spotted glaring inconsistencies immediately, missing evidence logs, vague witness statements, and a rushed conclusion blaming Maya's disappearance on random violence. It was the kind of sloppy work Elijah had seen too often, cases swept under the rug to protect someone powerful. A name caught his eye, Amara Townsend Maya's younger sister. Amara had been vocal in her criticism of the police's handling of the case, but her protest had been dismissed as grief-fueled hysteria. Elijah scribbled her address into his notebook and prepared to visit her, his mind buzzing with questions. #the Townsend residence. Amara Townsend lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city. The porch light flickered as Elijah approached, his coat dripping from the rain. He knocked twice and after a moment the door creaked open. Amara stood there, her eyes weary but alert. "Detective Cross?" she asked, her voice tinged with caution. Elijah nodded. "I'm revisiting your sister's case. I believe there's more to it than what was in the files." Amara hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "You're the first person from the department to say that in years. Come in." The living room was small but warm, filled with photographs of Maya. Elijah's eyes lingered on a picture of her smiling at a protest rally, a notebook in hand. "She was always chasing the truth," Amara said, noticing his gaze. "Even when it put her in danger." Elijah sat on the worn couch and opened his notebook. "Can you tell me about the weeks leading up to her disappearance? Anything unusual?" Amara nodded slowly, her brow furrowing in thought. "She was working on a big story. She wouldn't tell me the details, but she said it was going to expose some powerful people. She started getting phone calls, threats. I told her to be careful, but she just brushed it off. Said it came with the territory." Elijah leaned forward. "Did she mention anyone specific? A name? A place?" Amara shook her head. "No, but she was nervous. That wasn't like her. The night before she disappeared, she said something strange. If anything happens to me, it's not an accident." I didn't know what to make of it. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Elijah wrote it down, his mind racing. "Do you still have her phone records? Emails?" "I kept everything," Amara said, disappearing into another room. She returned with a box of documents, which she placed on the coffee table. "I didn't know what to do with it, but I couldn't throw it away." Elijah sifted through the contents, printed emails, old phone bills, and scribbled notes. One email stood out, a message Maya had sent to an unknown recipient the day she vanished. It read, "Meeting confirmed. If I'm not back by midnight, check the files under Project Kingsman." Returning to the precinct, Elijah locked himself in a spare office to review Maya's files. The email mentioned Project Kingsman, but there was no reference to it in the official case notes. It was clear that whoever had closed the case had deliberately omitted critical information. Elijah stared at the email, his mind piecing together fragments of a puzzle. Maya had been close to something big, something dangerous. And whatever Project Kingsman was, it had cost her everything. The faint sound of footsteps broke his concentration. He turned to see Captain Mercer standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're digging into Maya Townsend's case?" Mercer's tone was neutral, but his eyes betrayed irritation. Elijah nodded. "There's more to it than what's in the files." Mercer sighed. "Let it go, Cross. The case is dead and there's no point stirring up trouble." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "Trouble's already here, Captain. I'm just trying to find the truth." Mercer didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Elijah with the unsettling feeling that he was being watched. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, the box of Maya's files spread out before him. One by one he combed through the evidence, searching for connections. Finally he found it, a series of financial transactions tied to a shell company. The company was linked to a known real estate mogul, Victor Langston, a name Elijah recognized from other corruption cases. Elijah's pulse quickened. He was getting closer, but he also knew the closer he got, the more dangerous things would become. He picked up the phone and dialed Rachel Vance, the rookie officer who had shown interest in his investigation. "Vance," he said when she answered. "I need your help." And with that, the case was officially reopened. The morning broke gray and cold, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the weight in Elijah's chest. Seated in his cramped precinct office, the detective stared at the files spread across his desk. Amara Townsend's revelations from the night before had reignited his determination, but they had also opened a Pandora's box of questions. At the heart of it all was one cryptic phrase: Project Kingsman. Elijah began where Maya's trail had ended, her emails. Most were mundane exchanges with editors and sources, but a few stood out. One in particular, sent just hours before her disappearance, was flagged in bold. Meeting confirmed. Be ready for fallout. Project Kingsman is bigger than we thought. The recipient was listed as S.D, with no further identifying information. Elijah's instincts told him this was Maya's confidential source, the person she had been working with before everything went dark. If he could find SD, he might finally crack the case. Rachel Vance, the rookie officer assigned to assist him, walked in carrying 2 coffees. She placed one on his desk and glanced at the chaotic spread of papers and photos. "You look like you've been at this all night," she said. "Because I have," Elijah replied without looking up. He gestured to the email. "I think this SD might be the key. We need to find them." Rachel nodded. "I'll start tracing the email address. Might take some time though. Whoever they are, they've covered their tracks well." Returning to the crime scene. While Rachel worked on the trace, Elijah decided to revisit the site where Maya's belongings had been found 5 years ago. The overgrown lot was sandwiched between 2 crumbling warehouses, its chain-link fence sagging with rust. It was the kind of place where shadows lingered even in daylight. Elijah's eyes scanned the ground, searching for anything the original investigators might have missed. Near a corner of the lot, he spotted a glint of metal half buried in the dirt. He crouched down and pulled it free, a weathered piece of a broken surveillance camera. Someone was watching, he muttered to himself. The discovery sent a chill down his spine. If there had been surveillance, why wasn't it in the case file? Either the footage had been destroyed or someone had deliberately suppressed it. Elijah's next stop was the office of Harold Gaines, the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Maya had worked for. The building was old, its walls lined with awards and faded clippings. Harold greeted Elijah with a guarded expression, his hands nervously adjusting his tie. "I told the police everything I knew back then," Harold said, leaning back in his chair. "I don't see how I can help you now." "You told them what was safe to say," Elijah countered. "But I think you held something back." Harold hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in. Finally he sighed and opened a drawer, pulling out a small flash drive. "Maya gave me this the week before she disappeared," he said. She told me to keep it safe, but after what happened to her, I didn't have the guts to go public with it. Elijah took the drive, his pulse quickening. What's on it? Notes, recordings, maybe more. She was working on something massive, bigger than I could handle. I didn't know what to do. You should have come forward, Elijah said, though his tone lacked judgment. He pocketed the drive. I'll take it from here. Back at the precinct, Elijah plugged the drive into his laptop. It contained a treasure trove of information, encrypted documents, audio recordings of hushed conversations, and a spreadsheet of names tied to suspicious financial transactions. At the center of it all was a single name, Victor Langston. The moment Elijah began piecing things together, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, expecting Rachel, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. You're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, Detective Cross, the voice growled. Back off or you'll end up like her. The line went dead before Elijah could respond. He clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. If someone was willing to threaten him, it meant he was getting close. Rachel burst into the office an hour later, her face lit with excitement. I traced the email address. It's tied to a prepaid phone registered under the name Simon Drake. Elijah's eyebrows rose. Drake? That name sounds familiar. He's a former city planner, Rachel explained. Disappeared around the same time as Maya. Elijah grabbed his coat. Let's find him. Tracking Simon Drake wasn't easy, but after hours of following leads, they found him living in a rundown motel on the edge of town. When Elijah and Rachel knocked, Simon cracked the door open, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know anything, he said, attempting to shut the door. Elijah wedged his foot in the frame. We're not here to arrest you. We're here to protect you. Simon hesitated before letting them in. His room was a chaotic mess of papers, maps, and red string diagrams. He paced nervously as he spoke. Maya and I were working on exposing a development project. Kingsman Estates, Simon said. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Langston and his people were buying off city officials, cops, anyone who stood in their way. Why didn't you go public? Rachel asked. Simon laughed bitterly. You think they wouldn't silence me too? I ran because I didn't want to end up like Maya. Before Elijah could press for more, headlights swept across the room. Simon's face turned pale. They found me. A black SUV idled outside. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements deliberate and menacing. Stay here, Elijah ordered Rachel. He and Simon slipped out the back, weaving through alleys until they lost the pursuers. By the time Elijah returned to the precinct, Simon was gone, vanished without a trace. On his desk sat a single note in Simon's handwriting. Asterisk, Kingsman will destroy you if you get too close. Be careful. Asterisk. Elijah stared at the note, his mind racing. The stakes were higher than he'd anticipated, but he couldn't stop now. Let's see how deep this goes, he muttered to himself, pulling up the files on Victor Langston. Elijah Cross stood in the precinct's bustling hallway, a thick folder under his arm and weariness etched into his features. The events of the previous night, Simon Drake's cryptic warnings, the dark SUV, and Simon's sudden disappearance had kept him awake. Now he was more convinced than ever that Maya Townsend's case was tied to something much larger. As he passed a group of officers, their conversations hushed. Elijah could feel their gazes lingering, judgment heavy in the air. He was no stranger to the undercurrents of tension that came with his investigations, especially those that made the department uncomfortable. Detective Cross, Captain Mercer's gruff voice pulled him from his thoughts. Mercer stood in the doorway of his office, arms crossed. A word. Inside Mercer's office, the captain didn't bother with pleasantries. What the hell are you doing stirring up the Townsend case again? We buried that for a reason. Elijah met Mercer's glare, unflinching. You mean you buried it? I'm digging it up. Mercer leaned forward, his voice lowering. You're walking a dangerous line, Cross. Don't think you're untouchable. Leave this alone. Elijah said nothing, but as he walked out of Mercer's office, his resolve only strengthened. Whatever they were hiding, he would uncover it. Later that day, Rachel Vance met Elijah in the precinct's parking lot. She had been reassigned to a petty theft case, an obvious attempt to sideline her from the Townsend investigation. Her frustration was palpable. "They're trying to keep me out of it," she said, shoving a file into Elijah's hands. "But I pulled this before Mercer's goons could get to it. It's a list of officers who worked Maya's case. Some of them had ties to Victor Langston." Elijah scanned the file. Names jumped out at him, familiar names from past corruption allegations. He nodded. "This is good. Let's keep this between us." Rachel hesitated. "You know they're watching us, right? Every step we take, they'll try to stop us." Elijah gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Then we make sure we're always one step ahead." Armed with Rachel's intel, Elijah decided it was time to confront Victor Langston, the real estate tycoon whose name kept surfacing. Langston's mansion sat on sprawling grounds, a testament to obscene wealth and power. Security guards eyed Elijah warily as he approached the gate. "I'm here to see Langston," Elijah said, flashing his badge. After a tense wait, Langston emerged, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His demeanor was that of a man who knew he was untouchable. "Detective Cross," he said, his voice smooth. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm looking into Maya Townsend's case," Elijah said, cutting straight to the point. "Your name came up." Langston chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. "I don't see how I'm relevant to that tragedy." "A shame really, but I had no connection to her." Elijah studied him, noting the faint twitch in Langston's jaw. "Funny. Your name is all over her notes. Kingsman Estates, for one." Langston's smile faded. "Detective, I suggest you tread carefully. You're in over your head." Elijah leaned in, his voice cold. "So were the people who covered for you. I'll find out what you're hiding." As Elijah turned to leave, he noticed a pair of guards subtly adjusting their earpieces, their eyes tracking him. The tension was palpable. Langston wasn't just wealthy, he was dangerous. That night, as Elijah drove home, he noticed headlights following him. At first, he thought it was paranoia, but when the car sped up and swerved to block his path, he knew it was deliberate. Elijah slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. 3 men stepped out of the other car, their faces obscured by masks. One of them brandished a crowbar, while the others approached with grim determination. Elijah reached for his gun just as the first man swung the crowbar at his windshield, shattering it. Acting quickly, Elijah kicked open his door, using it as a shield, and fired a warning shot into the air. The attackers hesitated, then retreated back to their car. As they sped off, Elijah caught a glimpse of their license plate, a partial number that he quickly noted. Breathing heavily, he called Rachel. "We've got a problem." The next day, Elijah reported the incident, but Mercer dismissed it as a random act of road rage. "You're getting paranoid, Cross," Mercer said with a smirk. "Maybe it's time you took some leave." Elijah knew better. The ambush wasn't random, and Mercer's indifference only confirmed his suspicions. He was on his own, and the walls were closing in. Even Rachel seemed uneasy. "You think Mercer's involved?" she asked. Elijah hesitated before answering. "If he's not, he knows who is. Either way, we can't trust anyone in this precinct." Determined to keep pushing forward, Elijah reached out to Samuel Holt, a retired detective who had once led the Townsend investigation before being abruptly reassigned. Holt agreed to meet at a diner on the outskirts of town. Over black coffee and quiet conversation, Holt confirmed Elijah's worst fears. "There were orders from above," Holt said, his voice low. "We found evidence that pointed straight to Langston, but it disappeared. They told me to shut it down or face reassignment." "Who gave the orders?" Elijah pressed. Holt glanced around nervously. "Mercer." But he wasn't acting alone. "Langston owns half the city, including people in this department." Elijah left the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. He now had a name, a connection, and a reason to keep fighting. But he also knew the stakes were higher than ever. That night, Elijah returned to his office to find his desk in disarray. Files were missing and a single note was left behind. Asterisk, "Last warning, Cross. Drop it." Asterisk. Elijah crumpled the note, his resolve hardening. He glanced at the board where he had pinned photos of Maya, Langston, and the others involved. The pieces were falling into place and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. Elijah sat in his dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of city noise filtering through the window. On the coffee table in front of him, Simon Drake's cryptic note sat next to a pile of disorganized files. Asterisk, Kingsman will destroy you if you get too close. Be careful. Asterisk. His mind replayed the events of the past week, the threats, the ambush, and Simon's sudden disappearance. Whoever was behind Kingsman was determined to silence anyone who got too close. But the warning only fueled Elijah's determination. The sound of his phone vibrating broke the silence. It was Rachel. I think I've found something, she said, her voice urgent. Meet me at the station. At the precinct, Rachel was waiting with her laptop open. I traced Simon's movements using the motel's surveillance footage. He checked out an hour after we left and took a bus headed west. Any idea where he went? Elijah asked. Rachel shook her head. Not yet, but there's more. Remember that partial license plate from the SUV that ambushed you? It's registered to a shell company tied to Langston Enterprises. Elijah leaned over the screen, his jaw tightening. So Langston's cleaning up loose ends? Rachel hesitated before adding, it gets worse. I accessed a list of transactions from Langston's accounts. There's a recurring payment to a private security firm, one that employs several off-duty cops. Elijah's stomach turned. They're using our own people against us. With Simon's trail still fresh, Elijah and Rachel hit the road, following the bus route westward. The search led them to a remote diner off the highway, where a waitress confirmed she had seen Simon earlier that morning. He looked nervous, she said, wiping down a counter. Kept checking the door. Left in a rush, but not before he dropped this. She handed Elijah a crumpled napkin with hastily scribbled directions. At the bottom, Simon had written, Asterisk, storage 57, key hidden under blue box. Asterisk. Elijah and Rachel exchanged a look. It was a lead, but it reeked of desperation and danger. The storage facility was a desolate place on the outskirts of town, its rows of rusted units stretching into the horizon. Elijah and Rachel parked outside Unit 57, the air thick with tension. Rachel found the blue box Simon had mentioned and retrieved the key. If this is a trap, she began. It's not, Elijah interrupted, though he wasn't entirely sure. Simon's scared, but he wants us to find this. They opened the unit, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with boxes and folders. At the center of the chaos was an old laptop resting on a makeshift desk. Elijah booted it up while Rachel sifted through the files. This is it, Rachel said, holding up a folder labeled Kingsman, Classified. The folder contained a series of incriminating documents, city contracts, bank statements, and signed agreements implicating Langston and a network of officials in a land development scheme. The operation involved displacing entire communities under the guise of urban renewal, using coercion, bribery, and even violence. But the most damning discovery was a list of names, officers, politicians, and business leaders, all tied to Kingsman. Among them was Captain Mercer. As they processed the files, Elijah's phone buzzed with an alert. Someone had tripped the storage unit's security alarm. He glanced at Rachel, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. Time's up, he muttered. Seconds later, the unit door rattled violently. Elijah and Rachel scrambled to gather the evidence as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. They barely managed to slip out the back exit before the door burst open, revealing two armed men. The chase was frantic. Elijah and Rachel darted between rows of storage units, dodging gunfire. In the chaos, Rachel managed to snap a photo of their pursuers with her phone. They were the same men from the SUV. Elijah and Rachel made it back to their car, peeling out of the storage facility as the armed men fired after them. The adrenaline was palpable as they sped down the highway, the incriminating files now sitting on the back seat. This just became a war, Rachel said, her voice shaking. Elijah nodded grimly. And we're not safe anywhere. That night, Elijah made a bold move. Using the files from the storage unit, he sent an anonymous tip to a local journalist he trusted. The files exposed the financial connections between Langston Enterprises and the city's corrupt officials. hinting at something far darker. The next morning the headline read, Asterisk, whistleblower leaks evidence tying Langston to corruption scandal. Asterisk. Elijah knew the article was only the first shot. Langston wouldn't take this lying down, but the public exposure meant he couldn't act as openly. For the first time, the powerful tycoon was on the defensive. Just as Elijah began to feel a sliver of hope, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of Rachel, taken through a sniper's scope with the caption, Asterisk, back off or she's next. Asterisk. Elijah stared at the screen, his blood running cold. The message was clear. Langston's war had only just begun. The dim glow of Elijah's desk lamp reflected off the photo of Rachel through the sniper's scope, the chilling caption glaring back at him, back off or she's next. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the phone. It wasn't just about him anymore. Langston and his network were targeting anyone close to him. Rachel sat across from him, her face pale but her resolve unwavering. So what's the plan? Because we're not backing off. Elijah looked at her, admiration flickering briefly before his usual stoicism returned. We push forward but smarter. They're watching us. We can't afford another mistake. Rachel nodded, but the tension between them was palpable. The stakes had never been higher. The next day, Elijah returned to the precinct to find his desk conspicuously empty. Files he'd been working on were gone, replaced with a single memo from Captain Mercer summoning him to his office. Inside, Mercer leaned back in his chair, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. Cross, your investigation has caused enough disruption. I'm suspending you pending an internal review. Elijah met Mercer's gaze, refusing to flinch. You're part of this, he said, his voice low but steady. How deep does it go? Mercer's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. Watch yourself, detective. You're treading dangerous waters. As Elijah left Mercer's office, he felt the weight of the department's betrayal. The walls were closing in, but he wasn't about to stop. That evening, Elijah met with Rachel and a small circle of trusted colleagues outside the precinct. Among them was Detective Marcus Reed, an old friend who had worked with Elijah on several high-profile cases. Mercer's trying to bury you, Marcus said, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to listen in. But I've seen enough to know you're onto something real. Rachel laid out the evidence from the storage unit, carefully edited to protect their source. Marcus's face darkened as he flipped through the documents. Langston's reach is deeper than I thought. We're going to need more than this to take him down. Elijah nodded. We don't just need evidence. We need to expose this publicly. Langston thrives in the shadows. Let's drag him into the light. With Marcus's help, Elijah and Rachel tracked down a mid-level enforcer in Langston's network, a man named Eddie Vargas. Eddie was known for running Langston's more discreet operations, intimidation, bribery, and cleanup jobs. They arranged to meet Eddie in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, under the guise of striking a deal. Eddie arrived late, his eyes darting nervously as he slid into the booth across from Elijah. What do you want? Eddie asked, his voice low. Names, Elijah said bluntly. We know Langston's running Kingsman and we know you're part of it. You help us and maybe we help you. Eddie hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. You don't understand. Langston's got everyone, cops, judges, even politicians. You can't win. Before Elijah could press further, a loud bang shattered the tension. A bullet tore through Eddie's chest, sending him sprawling across the table. Elijah and Rachel dove for cover as chaos erupted in the bar. The shooter was gone before they could react, but the message was clear. Langston would eliminate anyone who dared betray him. Back at their safe house, Rachel paced, her frustration boiling over. We're losing control, Elijah. Langston's always one step ahead. Elijah rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. We underestimated how far his reach goes. Vargas was our chance to crack this open, and now he's dead. Rachel stopped pacing and looked at him, determination burning in her eyes. Then we hit them where it hurts. Langston's money is the key. Without it, his network falls apart. Elijah nodded slowly, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. We follow the money. But first, we need someone who knows how to find it. Elijah reached out to an old contact, Simon Drake, who had gone dark after the storage unit incident. After hours of encrypted messages and burner phone calls, Simon finally agreed to meet in a secluded location. When they found him, Simon looked even more gaunt and paranoid than before. "You shouldn't have contacted me," he said, his voice trembling. "They're everywhere. We need your help," Elijah said firmly. "Langston's money trail, where does it lead?" Simon hesitated, then handed Elijah a flash drive. "This has everything I managed to compile before I went underground. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, shell companies, it's all there. But be careful. If Langston finds out you have this, you're dead." Elijah nodded. "Thanks, Simon. We'll protect you." As Simon disappeared into the night, Elijah and Rachel returned to their safe house, the flash drive now their most valuable asset. The data on the flash drive was explosive. It detailed years of financial transactions connecting Langston to bribes, money laundering, and illegal land acquisitions. Most importantly, it implicated high-ranking officials, including Mercer, in facilitating the operation. "This is it," Rachel said, her voice a mix of relief and dread. "This is what we need to take him down." Elijah looked at the files, knowing the risks. "We'll leak this to the press, but we need to act fast. Langston's not going to sit idle while we dismantle his empire." As they prepared to send the files to a trusted journalist, the safe house's power suddenly cut out, plunging the room into darkness. Elijah's phone buzzed with a message. "You've gone too far, Cross. This ends tonight." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed outside. Elijah and Rachel exchanged a tense glance, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons. The fight was coming to them and there was no turning back. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windshield as Elijah drove through the empty streets. The air inside the car was thick with tension, the weight of their recent escape still fresh. Simon's injuries had been stabilized, but he remained unconscious in the back seat. Rachel sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, her hands gripping her phone tightly. "He's not going to make it if we don't get help soon," Rachel said quietly, glancing back at Simon. His breathing was shallow and his face was ashen. Elijah tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We'll get him to the safe house. It's the only place we can keep him safe." "Safe from who?" Rachel shot back, her voice tinged with frustration. "We don't even know how many people are involved in this. For all we know, they're watching us right now." Elijah didn't respond. He knew she was right, but they didn't have any other options. The safe house, a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, was their last refuge. It was off the grid, with no ties to the department or anyone who might betray them. The safe house was dark when they arrived. Elijah parked the car around the back, out of sight, and helped Rachel carry Simon inside. The small space was sparsely furnished, with a few chairs, a table, and a cot in the corner. Elijah carefully laid Simon on the cot while Rachel began setting up medical supplies they had hastily gathered. "He's lost a lot of blood," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "But if we can keep him stable, he might have a chance." Elijah nodded, his mind already racing ahead. They needed a plan. The files Simon had provided were explosive, but they needed more than just evidence. They needed someone willing to expose the truth. Elijah scrolled through his contacts, his mind landing on one name: Linda Hayes, an investigative journalist known for taking on powerful figures. She had a reputation for fearless reporting, and Elijah knew she was their best shot at getting the story out. "I know someone who can help," Elijah said, dialing Linda's number. The phone rang several times before she picked up. "Cross," Linda said, her voice wary. "It's been a while." "I need your help," Elijah said without preamble. "I've got evidence that could blow the lid off the biggest corruption scandal this city's ever seen. But I can't do it alone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Meet me at the old train station. Midnight. And bring everything you've got." The train station was deserted, its once grand architecture now crumbling with neglect. Elijah and Rachel arrived early, parking their car in a hidden corner and scanning the area for any signs of surveillance. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and cold. Linda arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of a taxi and pulling her coat tightly around her. She approached them cautiously, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "This better be worth it," Linda said as she joined them inside the station. Elijah handed her a flash drive. "This has everything. Financial records, emails, surveillance footage. It ties Victor Langston and several city officials to money laundering, bribery, and murder." Linda's expression hardened. "And you trust me to handle this?" "You're the only one I trust," Elijah said simply. Linda nodded, slipping the drive into her bag. "I'll get to work. But you need to know, once this goes public they'll come after all of us. You ready for that?" Elijah met her gaze. "We've been ready since the day they killed Maya." As they returned to the safe house, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence around them felt too heavy, the air too still. When they stepped inside, the sense of unease deepened. Simon was gone. "What the hell?" Rachel exclaimed, rushing to the empty cot. The room was undisturbed, with no signs of a struggle. Elijah's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his stomach sinking as he read the message. "Asterisk, you can't save him. You can't save yourselves, asterisk." "They've got him," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "They knew where we were." "How?" Rachel asked, panic creeping into her voice. This place was supposed to be secure. Elijah's mind raced. Someone had betrayed them. But who? And why? Despite the setback, Elijah knew they couldn't afford to stop. Linda would release the files, but they needed to keep the pressure on. They had to find Simon before it was too late. "We're going to end this," Elijah said, determination etched into every word. "No matter what it takes." As they prepared to leave, Elijah glanced at the notebook Maya had left behind. Her words, scrawled in the margins of a page, seemed to echo in his mind. "The truth is the only weapon they can't take from you." The morning air was heavy, and the city seemed to hold its breath as Elijah prepared for the confrontation that was sure to come. The betrayal at the safe house had left him shaken but resolute. Simon's disappearance and the ominous message confirmed what Elijah already suspected. Their enemies were always a step ahead. But he wasn't about to let them win. "We're not going to wait for them to strike again," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We're taking the fight to Langston." Rachel looked up from the files spread across the table. "Langston's security is airtight. We can't just walk in and demand answers." "We're not going in blind," Elijah replied, pointing to a blueprint of Langston's estate. Simon's files mentioned a hidden room in his office, a vault where he keeps sensitive documents. "If we can get in, we'll have what we need to bury him." "And what about Simon?" Rachel asked. Her concern was evident, but Elijah could only shake his head. "We find Langston, we find Simon." That evening, Elijah and Rachel arrived near Langston's sprawling estate. The property was a fortress, surrounded by high walls and patrolled by armed guards. Using a combination of stealth and misdirection, they bypassed the outer defenses and made their way to the main building. Inside, the tension was palpable. Every creak of the floorboards and every shadow cast by the dim lights felt like a potential threat. Elijah led the way to Langston's office, his gun drawn and his senses on high alert. "This is it," he whispered, gesturing to the ornate door at the end of the hall. Rachel worked quickly to disable the lock. As the door swung open, they were greeted by the sight of a lavish office, its walls lined with shelves of books and trophies. But their target wasn't in plain sight. "Look for the vault," Elijah said, scanning the room. Rachel found it first, a hidden panel behind an oil painting that slid away to reveal a steel door. Elijah inspected the keypad. "This is high-tech. Can you crack it?" Rachel nodded, pulling out a small device. "Give me a minute." As she worked, Elijah kept watch. His nerves were fraying, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the lock clicked and the door swung open. Inside, the vault was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Binders of financial records, hard drives, and a folder labeled Kingsman. Elijah grabbed everything he could carry. "We've got what we need," he said. "Let's move." As they exited the office, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them in their tracks. Langston himself appeared, flanked by 2 armed guards. His face twisted into a smirk as he took in the scene. "Detective Cross," Langston said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I'd say I'm surprised, but you've always had a flair for the dramatic." Elijah didn't lower his weapon. "Step aside, Langston. This ends now." Langston chuckled. "You think you can take me down with a few files? You're out of your depth, detective. This operation is bigger than you can imagine." "You killed Maya Townsend," Elijah said, his voice steady. "You silenced Simon Drake. And you think you can keep getting away with it?" "Maya was a nuisance," Langston said, his tone cold. "And Simon? Well, he served his purpose. You should be more concerned about yourself, Cross. You've made powerful enemies." Before Langston could say more, Rachel moved. She fired a warning shot that sent the guards scrambling for cover. Elijah seized the moment, grabbing Langston and shoving him against the wall. "Where's Simon?" Elijah demanded. Langston laughed even as Elijah's grip tightened. "You'll never find him in time." The sound of reinforcements approaching forced Elijah and Rachel to retreat. They fled through the estate, dodging guards and gunfire, until they reached their getaway car. As they sped away, the weight of what they had uncovered pressed down on them. "We've got the evidence," Rachel said, her voice breathless. "But if Langston's right, Simon?" "We'll find him," Elijah said, though the doubt gnawed at him. Back at their temporary base, Elijah and Rachel uploaded the files to Linda Hayes. The journalist's face appeared on their screen, her expression grim as she reviewed the evidence. "This is enough to bring Langston and his allies down," Linda said. "But you need to be prepared for the fallout. They won't go quietly." Elijah nodded. "Do it. Expose them." As the story broke across every major news outlet, Elijah and Rachel prepared for the next move. But before they could act, Elijah's phone buzzed with a new message. It was a video of Simon, bound and beaten, with a single line of text. "You're running out of time." Elijah stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. "This isn't over." The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windshield as Elijah drove through the empty streets. The air inside the car was thick with tension, the weight of their recent escape still fresh. Simon's injuries had been stabilized, but he remained unconscious in the back seat. Rachel sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, her hands gripping her phone tightly. "He's not going to make it if we don't get help soon," Rachel said quietly, glancing back at Simon. His breathing was shallow and his face was ashen. Elijah tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We'll get him to the safe house. It's the only place we can keep him safe." "Safe from who?" Rachel shot back, her voice tinged with frustration. "We don't even know how many people are involved in this. For all we know, they're watching us right now." Elijah didn't respond. He knew she was right, but they didn't have any other options. The safe house, a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, was their last refuge. It was off the grid, with no ties to the department or anyone who might betray them. The safe house was dark when they arrived. Elijah parked the car around the back, out of sight, and helped Rachel carry Simon inside. The small space was sparsely furnished, with a few chairs, a table, and a cot in the corner. Elijah carefully laid Simon on the cot while Rachel began setting up medical supplies they had hastily gathered. "He's lost a lot of blood," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "But if we can keep him stable, he might have a chance." Elijah nodded, his mind already racing ahead. They needed a plan. The files Simon had provided were explosive, but they needed more than just evidence. They needed someone willing to expose the truth. Elijah scrolled through his contacts, his mind landing on one name: Linda Hayes, an investigative journalist known for taking on powerful figures. She had a reputation for fearless reporting, and Elijah knew she was their best shot at getting the story out. "I know someone who can help," Elijah said, dialing Linda's number. The phone rang several times before she picked up. "Cross," Linda said, her voice wary. "It's been a while." "I need your help," Elijah said without preamble. "I've got evidence that could blow the lid off the biggest corruption scandal this city's ever seen. But I can't do it alone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Meet me at the old train station. Midnight. And bring everything you've got." The train station was deserted, its once grand architecture now crumbling with neglect. Elijah and Rachel arrived early, parking their car in a hidden corner and scanning the area for any signs of surveillance. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and cold. Linda arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of a taxi and pulling her coat tightly around her. She approached them cautiously, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "This better be worth it," Linda said as she joined them inside the station. Elijah handed her a flash drive. "This has everything. Financial records, emails, surveillance footage. It ties Victor Langston and several city officials to money laundering, bribery, and murder." Linda's expression hardened. "And you trust me to handle this?" "You're the only one I trust," Elijah said simply. Linda nodded, slipping the drive into her bag. "I'll get to work. But you need to know, once this goes public they'll come after all of us. You ready for that?" Elijah met her gaze. "We've been ready since the day they killed Maya." As they returned to the safe house, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence around them felt too heavy, the air too still. When they stepped inside, the sense of unease deepened. Simon was gone. "What the hell?" Rachel exclaimed, rushing to the empty cot. The room was undisturbed, with no signs of a struggle. Elijah's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his stomach sinking as he read the message. "Asterisk, you can't save him. You can't save yourselves, asterisk. They've got him," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "They knew where we were." "How?" Rachel asked, panic creeping into her voice. This place was supposed to be secure. Elijah's mind raced. Someone had betrayed them. But who? And why? Despite the setback, Elijah knew they couldn't afford to stop. Linda would release the files, but they needed to keep the pressure on. They had to find Simon before it was too late. "We're going to end this," Elijah said, determination etched into every word. "No matter what it takes." As they prepared to leave, Elijah glanced at the notebook Maya had left behind. Her words, scrawled in the margins of a page, seemed to echo in his mind. "The truth is the only weapon they can't take from you." The room was silent as Elijah stared at the live video feed on his phone. Linda Hayes, bruised but defiant, sat tied to a chair in a darkened room. The distorted voice in the background repeated its chilling message. Asterisk, back off or she dies. Asterisk. Rachel paced the room, her fists clenched. "They're trying to break us. If we stop now, everything we've done will be for nothing." Elijah's voice was calm but firm. "We're not stopping. Langston thinks he's untouchable, but he's wrong. This ends tonight." Simon, still weak but determined, spoke from the corner. "The ledger. It's at Langston's private retreat. If we get it, we can expose every last one of them." Elijah nodded. "And save Linda?" The retreat was a secluded mansion nestled deep in the hills, surrounded by dense forests and patrolled by armed guards. Elijah and Rachel reviewed the blueprint Simon had sketched out, marking entry points and key locations. "We go in fast and quiet," Elijah said. "Rachel, you find Linda. Simon and I will get the ledger. Once we have it, we regroup and get out." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Let's end this." Under the cover of darkness, the trio approached the retreat. The air was heavy with tension as they scaled the perimeter fence and navigated the grounds. The guards were alert, but Elijah and Rachel moved with precision, taking them down silently. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. Rachel split off toward the lower levels, where Linda was likely being held, while Elijah and Simon headed to Langston's office. The office was grand and imposing, its walls lined with books and art. Behind a large desk, Elijah found a hidden panel concealing a safe. Simon quickly began working on it, his hands trembling but steady. "Hurry," Elijah urged, his eyes on the door. The safe clicked open, revealing the ledger. A thick, leather-bound book filled with names, transactions, and evidence of corruption spanning years. Elijah's breath caught as he realized the magnitude of what they had uncovered. "This is it," he said. "Let's move." Rachel found Linda in a dimly lit basement, guarded by two men. She took them out with swift precision, her movements fueled by adrenaline and determination. Linda looked up as Rachel approached, relief washing over her face. "I knew you'd come," Linda said, her voice hoarse. "We're not leaving without you," Rachel replied, cutting the ropes binding her hands. "Can you walk?" Linda nodded, though her steps were unsteady. Together, they began making their way back to the rendezvous point. As Elijah and Simon exited the office, they were confronted by Langston and a group of armed men. Langston's smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. "You really think you've won, Cross?" Langston sneered. "Even if you get out of here, you'll never take me down." Elijah raised his gun, his voice steady. "Your time is up, Langston." "It's over?" Langston laughed, signaling his men to open fire. Chaos erupted as bullets flew, shattering glass and tearing through the opulent decor. Elijah and Simon took cover, returning fire with precision. Rachel and Linda arrived just in time, flanking Langston's men and evening the odds. The battle was intense, but one by one Langston's guards fell. In the end, Langston stood alone, cornered and defeated. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Langston spat. "This network runs deeper than you can imagine." "We'll see about that," Elijah said, securing the ledger. "It's over?" With the ledger in hand, Elijah and Rachel worked with Linda to release the information to the public. The files were sent to every major news outlet, ensuring the truth couldn't be buried. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Langston and his allies were arrested, and investigations into the corruption network began sweeping through the city. Simon, though scarred by his ordeal, found solace in knowing his whistleblowing had made a difference. "You saved more lives than you know," Elijah told him. Weeks later, Elijah stood on the steps of the precinct, watching as protesters celebrated the downfall of Langston's empire. Rachel joined him, a rare smile on her face. "Think they'll ever stop fighting us?" she asked. "Probably not," Elijah replied. "But at least now they know we won't back down." As the sun set over the city, Elijah felt a sense of closure. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in years he felt hope. The truth had prevailed and justice, however hard won, had been served. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there, turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters. Folded Hands Sparkles.